This is the I'm Giving Notice podcast, episode number 3.
This is the I'm Giving Notice podcast, where you get to take control of life's big 3 and have the career, relationships, and health that you've always dreamed of. Now, get ready to say, I'm Giving Notice, with your host, Mace Haroff.
Well, hello again, and welcome to the I'm Giving Notice podcast. My name is Mace Haroff. My guest today is Dr. Helen Turnbull. Dr. Turnbull is a world-recognized thought leader on inclusion and diversity. She is also the recognized expert on unconscious bias, and we're going to be talking about that today and how unconscious bias affects the behaviors that impact our relationships and our health and how we perform at work. In May 2013, Dr. Turnbull delivered a TEDx talk entitled The Illusion of Inclusion. I saw it live, and I've watched it multiple times online. It's an awesome presentation, and it really got me thinking about my own biases. Dr. Turnbull speaks all over the world for impressive clients that include Texas Instruments, JP Morgan Chase, Microsoft, Xerox, Miller Coors Brewing, and Citigroup. She just received the Certified Speaking Professional designation from the National Speakers Association. That's the CSP you'll see after her name. This is a designation that has been earned by less than 8% of the world's professional speakers. Dr. Turnbull has a very long and impressive bio, and you can find it on the speaking notes page for this episode at www.imgivingnotice.com/3, the number 3. Dr. Turnbull, welcome.
Thank you, Mace. I'm happy to be here. Looking forward to our discussion.
So am I, Helen. I've been really excited about it. Dr. Turnbull, you're an international expert on unconscious biases, and our conversation today is going to revolve around unconscious bias. So before we go any further, what is unconscious bias?
Well, you know, it's an interesting question because if you think about history, there's been seismic shifts in our consciousness around different processes, from Copernicus to Darwin to Freud, who told us that not only do we have a conscious mind, but we have an unconscious and subconscious mind, to Daniel Kahneman's work on fast and slow thinking. And in recent years, a lot of work in the field of neuroscience using functional MRIs that we're beginning to understand the inner workings of our brain in ways that we've never had access to before. And to become aware that unconscious biases are the mental models, if you like, that we carry that influence our thinking without us being consciously aware that we're being influenced by them. So our unconscious biases carry the prejudices and the stereotypes, are the mental models that we're actually operating out of when we make decisions about things and about people and about the things that we do. I think one of the misconceptions is when we hear the word unconscious bias, there might be a tendency for people to say, well, I don't have that. It doesn't sound too good and I don't want to take ownership. The truth is that we all have unconscious bias, and that no one gets to be a phenomenological exception, not even me. So,
well, I understand how people feel about that, because certainly we don't like to be accused of having biases. And what's even more disturbing is to think we have these thoughts in our mind that we're unaware of. No one really wants to be put in that category. So when it comes to life's big 3, careers, relationships, and health, does unconscious bias play into the decisions or the behaviors, for example, that affect the choices or the decisions we make at work?
Well, you know, look, I think the short answer would be yes, because unconscious bias affects everything that we do. I'm a big believer in what I call social construction theory, that we're all constructing or socially constructing stories in our head. So that if the story that I've made up in my head is self-limiting, you know, I don't like my boss, I don't like my work, I don't like being there, I think about quitting every day, or you know, any variation of that, then obviously that's going to affect the energy that I expend and the ability that I have to be happy at work and to provide my employer with commitment rather than compliance. So these mental models and unconscious biases absolutely affect our work, our approach to work, and de facto they also then affect the relationships with the people around us and our health. Because if we're not happy, Mace, as you know, when we're not happy, it drains our energy, and it puts us in a very different emotional space in the way we interact with others.
Well, a lot of people, Dr. Turnbull, who are unhappy at work, for example, they would love to do something else, but they have these beliefs that, number one, they're not capable of doing anything else. In other words, they have a limited set of skills, limited knowledge. And some of the other things, some of the other options that might be available to them, they don't consider them as being realistic options. In other words, if you're working at a corporate job, the thought of going out, and becoming an entrepreneur for many people, they just don't believe it's possible. Have you ever experienced anything like that personally?
Me personally, I think I'm not risk averse actually, May. So I've tended to jump off the end of cliffs without a parachute my entire life and then think about it afterwards. So I'm probably not the best person to ask about entrepreneurship, because I certainly took that leap of faith and haven't regretted it and didn't look back. But I do work with and interview people all over the world who are in jobs where they feel a little bit stuck. They wish they could be an entrepreneur. They wish they could do something differently. And it is a risk aversion and fear that holds them back. And as I said, it's the story. Look, let's be realistic. It's not just the mental models that hold us back. It's the fear that you can't pay your mortgage that sometimes holds people back. Sure. And not everyone succeeds as an entrepreneur. So there's some legitimate fear there, and I don't want to minimize that. But focused on unconscious bias, I think, if I talk a little bit about some of the unconscious biases that might hold you back, one of them is, for example, it's called inattentional deafness, is that I'm not hearing the advice I'm getting from people around me. I'm not even hearing my own inner voice, which is a very important question. I'm not seeing all the clues that, yes, there is something I could do differently. And, because I'm risk averse, I lack the confidence to make the move.
Well, you talk about inattentional deafness. In other words, it sounds like there's a lot of people, they're unhappy at work. And if they're suffering from this inattentional deafness, is that they don't recognize it or they don't know why?
Yeah, I mean, look, sometimes I think when we talk about this, it sounds like we all need therapy, and maybe we do. But I think what you have to do really is to pay attention to the consistent messages you're getting. I mean, if for example, someone said to me recently, I think every day about quitting. I think every day about calling my boss and telling him I quit. Now, that's a pretty loud message in your head. If you're thinking about that every day, then perhaps you should do something about it. Perhaps it's a huge clue, not so much unconscious at that point, but almost conscious, that you need to look for other opportunities. So when we stop listening to that voice, when we stop listening to our own body's messages, then there's very little chance for us to be happy, if you like, because we're shutting out the unconscious message. I mean, it's knocking on your door when you think every single day, I think about quitting.
Well, that's telling you something, and that's really how this whole podcast evolved. The title of it, of course, being I'm Giving Notice. Saying those words was something I dreamed about for every day of almost a 20-year career. But it was very difficult for me to imagine having the skills or having the ability to do anything else where I would be able to earn the same amount of money that I was earning in that job. But yet it affected everything in my life. It affected my relationships. It had a huge impact on my health, although I didn't realize it at the time. Let me ask you a question, because you worked in corporate, at some point in your life, correct?
I did.
All right. So now you have this thriving, and I mean thriving, consulting, speaking practice. You have the assessments that you created, which are just catching on like crazy all over the world, where people are using the 2 assessments you designed. You said you were never risk averse, so you were willing to take that leap of faith to make the transition. But what was it? What was the thinking in your mind where you said, I can make this work? How did you cross that road?
Well, actually, when I came to this country in 1980, and I was working full-time with a corporate employer, and at that point got sent on a training program that captured my imagination around diversity and inclusion. And I thought, I'd like to do this. I'd like to become a consultant. And around the same time, the company I was working for decided to close the plant and move to New Jersey. And no respect to the Garden State, but I didn't want to leave Florida and move to New Jersey. So it was almost like the universe catapulted me out of the comfort level of a corporate job. And I decided, just go for it. I left with my last paycheck in my hand. And a small anecdotal aside here is I went out and ordered business cards, very fancy, expensive business cards. I think at the time it was going to cost me $300 for a letterheading with gold foil on them, and you know me, May, so I like things to be nice. And when the printer called that day to say you can come and pick up your business cards, I didn't have the money to pay for these business cards and letterheading and envelopes. And I went to the mailbox, and in the mail was the check for my returned pension plan funds. And I felt like the heavens opened and angels were singing, and I said, wow, this is a sign. And whether it was wise or not, I rushed off to the printers and paid for my letterheading and business cards. And they sat on a shelf for 2 or 3 years, and I never used them.
So what did you do instead? You didn't have the business cards, but certainly you launched into your business somehow, because you wouldn't be at the level of success you're at today. What did you do at that point?
I did. You know what? It was transitional, because I was very fortunate that a consulting colleague of mine offered me subcontracting work. And I thought, you know what, that's going to pay the bills, I'll take it. And I did some subcontracting work for her for about 6 months, and from there began to get to know people and clients who started to give me work. And I'm very privileged, Mace, because I don't do any cold calling. I get all of my business by referrals, and I have done for many years, and that's an incredible privilege. So for me it was, and look, just to be realistic about entrepreneurship, it's not easy.
No,
I've
it's
had
not.
my downs as well as my ups, and frankly, I work longer hours today than I ever worked in a corporate job. So anyone that thinks, hey, I'll be my own boss, this will be great, that's not the way it works, and you know that too. Entrepreneurship is almost a 24/7 dedication.
Well, let me ask you a question, because I know that you have taught at some universities, and certainly if the consulting with corporations wasn't working, you always had the option of going to work as a university professor. And I don't know if you ever considered that, but somehow you decided to make a go of it on your own. That wasn't the path you chose. I know you've done it here and there, because universities are always contacting you. But what was it that enabled you to stay the course during the ups and downs of really entrepreneurship, running your own show?
A couple of things. I think my complete and total passion for the subject matter. I was listening to Nido Qubein yesterday on a web conference, and I can't remember what he said, but he talked about the fact that you needed to have dedication and passion. That you need the three things you need in life are: you need to be healthy, you need to have money to pay your bills, and you need a sense of purpose. And I think the thing that kept me going, even in the bad times, even when money wasn't flowing, Miss, was having a sense of purpose and a belief that what I had to offer was important to the world. And I say that with some humility, but that kept me going. And I think the fact that somehow I realized that I don't really fit in too well inside the corporate world. I do my best work working with the corporate world.
We hear a lot when people are talking about entrepreneurship that they'll say, find something you're passionate about. Go out and do that. But the reality is some people's passions just, no one's going to pay money for it. Some passions just aren't, you're not able to monetize those passions. Now, clearly, you've been able to do that with yours because it solves a major problem in the world in the topics of inclusion and diversity. But yet, what would be your advice to someone? I mean, where it comes to, I'm talking about the type of person who would like to do something else. Would you advise them to examine their passions first before moving forward? And if so, how could they test to see whether or not their passions are really viable in the open marketplace?
It's a good point, because I have met people whose passion for what they're selling, really, I'm like, seriously, that's not going to sell. So I do think you have to test it. And the first place you can test it is when you're telling people about it. If you really pay attention to their face when you're talking to them, you'll see whether their eyes light up or their eyes kind of get really glassed over and they think, oh. So if you're actually paying attention to their biases, to how they're responding to you, you'll get your first clues as to whether your passion is isolated or your passion is something that other people can become animated about. I mean, obviously, if you're really passionate, then my advice would be don't give up. But I think that you have to pay attention to the signals that you're getting, because it goes back to what I said at the beginning. If we have inattentional deafness and inattentional blindness and our resistance to seeing the messages around us, then we're going to fail because we're ignoring what the universe is putting right in front of our faces.
Yeah, so what you're really saying is don't ignore your own feelings. If you're recognizing something, like I did for all those years, with dreaming every day of saying I'm giving notice, you have to pay attention to it. You can't ignore it.
Yes. I think that's the key, that if you ignore it for too long, then either the dream's going to go away or your health's going to suffer because you're unhappy. I have a friend who is quite unhappy at the moment, and she's contemplating making significant changes in her life. But she's also aware of the risks of doing that and the fear of doing it. And I think the choice point is, how many more years do you want to live in that situation? Or do you want to take a risk? And because the thing is, you can take the risk, make the change, and if it doesn't work, you can go back and do whatever it was you were doing before in some form. So
I want to shift to relationships, because the relationships we have with others is such a major part of our lives. Unconscious biases, how do they affect the relationships we have with people, the people at work, people in our lives, family, friends, etc.?
Yes. Look, obviously unconscious bias does affect our relationships at work and at home, because unconscious bias plays a part in gender, it plays a part in race and culture and sexual orientation and age, etc. For example, my research shows that when you look at the issue of gender at work, that women are much more likely to be given feedback on lacking gravitas and presence. So they don't have enough presence, they don't have enough gravitas, they're not exhibiting leadership qualities, whereas men are more likely to be, even if they're quiet and unassuming, to be considered as, yes, he's quiet, but when he speaks, he's bringing something meaningful to the table. The challenge for women around the unconscious bias is they're either told you lack gravitas and presence or you're too pushy. And there's other words for that. So there's a continuum there that becomes confusing. And it is manifesting the unconscious biases for people who don't realize that they're actually judging men and women differently based on the same criteria. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, even in the same gender, like in the male world, we often find that people will selectively choose, for example, a man who is taller if they're choosing him for a position of power, such as a leadership position. We often see this in political campaigns where when they do blind polls, a lot of times voters will pick the taller candidate. So would that be a bias that a man who is taller, it would be a better leader, is more powerful? How does that play in?
Yes, and absolutely, Mace. I mean, there's some really good research on that. That's, particularly in the U.S., we tend to favor tall candidates. And all of the presidents, if you look at Reagan and George Bush, senior and junior, you look at Obama, they're all over 6 foot tall. And actually, history shows that we've elected taller and taller presidents. And there is an argument there that maybe John McCain was never going to beat Obama just on height alone. But I'll leave that one for someone else to explore. tallness is equated with status and leadership. And lots of CEOs and airline pilots are also tall. We have more confidence at an unconscious level, especially with tall men. Tall women, I think, might sometimes get different labels. But when we see taller men, we think that they've got more stature and more status. And there was some research that suggested that actually taller people earn a little bit more. I think it was $920 a year or something more than people who are smaller. So it's an interesting statistic, and it's not conscious.
So I think it's time for me to put lifts in my shoes. I'm 5'8", yes, so if I could boost myself up to 6 feet, I could probably earn more money.
I think you could, and it would be good research made to try and demonstrate that. Weight is another issue because we have all these biases about people who are overweight. And, as somebody who's struggled with that all my life, and I certainly working in this industry, I'm acutely aware of these biases. So, if we could actually raise these things to consciousness to make people aware that we say we shouldn't judge a book by its covers, but we're unconsciously and quickly judging people.
Well, here's one I want to ask you about because, I've worked in healthcare most of my life. And this is a bias that it absolutely flabbergasts me. I'm probably even a little guilty of it myself. But whenever we hear someone has the diagnosis of lung cancer, there is a tendency to want to blame them as if it's their own fault. Now, number one, that means we're making the assumption that person, that he or she was a smoker, even though we don't know. The reality is there's some percentage, I'm not really sure what it is, there's some percentage of lung cancer patients who never smoked a day in their lives. But yet there is this overwhelming bias, I guess, if you will, that you have lung cancer, well, it's your fault. So that's a rather extreme case of bias, isn't it?
Well, that's interesting because I personally don't have that bias, so I've never heard that before, but I'm willing to accept that people do think like that. That is a bias. I think what's more worrying is the research in the healthcare industry that's being conducted around unconscious bias that shows that white people are more likely to be given blood pressure medication or appropriate medication when they're departing the hospital rather than people of color, and treated differently. And I think there are unconscious biases in our health system around how people are treated based on their age or their ethnicity. So there's a lot of work to be done in this field, and it has serious not just career-limiting ramifications, but it has ramifications for the health of people based on your race, culture, or gender.
That's huge, and that is really something that I find incredible, but believable. Nevertheless, I want to go back to relationships because when I think about relationships, for example, with family, and I could use smoking again as an example. I have smokers in my family. My sister, I have one sister. She's older than I am. She's a smoker, and I don't tolerate smoke very well. It just annoys me. I tend to avoid people in my family if, for example, they do things I don't like. Now my sister happens to be a very, very nice person. But yet, for my entire life, I've just never been able to get past this thing with her being a smoker because no matter what I say, she's going to do it. She smells from smoke. And somehow this bias against people who smoke just carries over into all areas of my life. In other words, Helen, when I meet someone who's a smoker, I almost immediately have the feeling that, I don't want to really know them. I don't want to have a relationship with them. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that I've recognized that as a very limiting bias that I have. And even though I'm consciously aware of it, I still struggle with getting past it. What can someone like me who has these biases, which I've identified, that we know about, what can we do to mitigate them, to handle them?
Yeah, I think of it, that's definitely a conscious bias as distinct from unconscious. Yeah. And again, it's a mental model that we carry based on our own experiences. And I'm not going to tell you or anyone else that bias would be wrong, Mace, because I certainly understand it. I have a brother who smokes, and I don't like being around smoke either. And so I've got a lot of the issues you do as well. I think the issue is to be able to, first of all, I talk about the fact that our biases tend to live somewhere in the back of our neck, where we think that we're right in the way we're thinking, and we don't question the rightness of that, or we don't look at it as a negative judgment of others. We just think, this is the way it should be. You should conform with my way of thinking. And of course, you have to move these biases from the back of your neck to the edge of your shoulder, almost like Jiminy Cricket. It has to become part of your conscience so that you can see it in your peripheral vision, and you're aware and more mindful that you're making a judgment about not just your sister, but anyone that you meet who smokes. And the question then becomes, is this fair? Before I open my mouth, before I shut that person out and behave in an exclusive way, am I being fair to that individual and or to myself? Because arguably, you're entitled to have a smoke-free environment, but are you limiting the relationships you could have by holding on so tightly to that judgment?
Yeah, I see exactly what you mean. And, the reality is the people who I know who smoke, they don't do it around me. But yet somehow I have to look past the smoking to really see the value that they add to a relationship, or really the kind of people they are. Before you go, I want to find out, are there any books that you could recommend to our listeners that could help them have a better understanding of their own unconscious biases so they can take control of these? Anything you recommend?
Yeah, there's a number of books that are really my favorites, and it depends how deep you want to get. But one of them is Derald Wing Sue, Derald, and then Wing, Wing, last name Sue, Microaggressions in Everyday Life. And he talks about the small ways, the micro inequities, the things that happen for people. Another one's by Alan Johnson, Allan Johnson, called Privilege, Power, and Difference.
Well, Dr. Turnbull, thank you so much for really shedding some light to make unconscious bias conscious. And I've certainly enjoyed the conversations I've had with you over the years. Dr. Turnbull is a dear friend, and she's certainly made me aware of many of the unconscious biases that I have, that I guess are now conscious biases, which really makes me a lot more cognizant of my world, and it's really helped to improve my thoughts about my work, the relationships I have with people, and certainly with my health. So, Helen, any parting pieces of advice you have for our listeners?
Yeah, I think I'll end with where I started, Mace. First of all, thank you for inviting me today. I likewise enjoyed our conversation. I think that the most powerful thing you can do is examine your own mental models, the ones that are holding you back, the ones that are causing you to judge other people, the ones that are stopping you from having relationships or changing that job, because they're the things that are getting in your way. And don't blame other people. It's actually you. So the person to look at is right there in the mirror.
And just one last thing, I have to ask this question because we talked about, you made the comment earlier that maybe everybody needs therapy. And I think it's pretty normal to have these biases.
Look, you know what? As long as you're breathing, you're going to have these struggles. So all of us have unconscious biases. My first red flag is when somebody says, I don't have any biases. And I think, oh, there's one. So, we all have them. It's very normal. And no one gets to be an exception. So the question is, my favorite quote is from Socrates, who said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And my quote is, the unchallenged brain is not worth trusting. So you definitely have to look at the stories in your head.
That is two awesome quotes, one from Socrates and one from Dr. Helen Turnbull. I will put those up on the show notes site, and you can get the show notes at www.imgivingnotice.com/3. Dr. Turnbull, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with me and with the listeners here at the I'm Giving Notice podcast. I really appreciate it, learned a lot, and I look forward to seeing you on the speaking stage again soon.
Thank you, Mace. Take care.
And thank you for joining us this week on the I'm Giving Notice podcast. Hope you'll join us again soon, where we help you to take control of life's big three. I'll talk to you soon.
This has been the I'm Giving Notice podcast with Mace Haroff. For show notes and more information about how you can take control of life's big three, please visit www.imgivingnotice.com.